Okay, so moving on to another issue, which became a public relations problem for Mars Hill. Uh, did the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, when they came to visit and look over the finances, particularly in relation to the Global Fund, did they all find anything that they considered to be amiss? Uh, did uh, uh, did they have any suggestions for you that they kind of wanted to keep quiet, or how was that all handled? I know you acknowledged that maybe the messaging was confusing, but that was something that I covered a good bit, and maybe I thought I found more than I did. I was always very curious about that one, and EFCA has come down pretty hard on some other groups for what seems like maybe some similar messaging issues here in recent days. So I'm just kind of curious how they handled that with you guys.
Yeah, so we called them in. So Dan Busby, who was the head of ECFA, and our auditor from Clark Newber came to the church, and I had them in our office and spent an entire day with both of them, going through all of the information on Mars Hill Global. And let me first say, I did a very bad job of communicating about Mars Hill Global. My fault. This isn't Mark Driscoll's fault. This is my fault. I take full responsibility for Mars Hill Global. It was a situation where I think I got a little overly excited about the opportunity to help people in Ethiopia, at the same time raising dollars, global dollars of people that were podcasters to fund not only church plants and those types of things. Mars Hill Global was way before me, but I really put gasoline to the fire as far as Mars Hill Global. From my vantage point, Mars Hill in the past had never really done anything international, missions type of stuff. And so I wanted to bring in Compassion International and let's adopt a whole bunch of kids all over the world. I just was really fired up about it. And I think what my issue is that I did not clearly communicate Mars Hill Global and what we're doing in Ethiopia. Give to Mars Hill Global and you're giving to Ethiopia. I think that those two quickly, because I was so excited about Ethiopia. I still am. I mean, my son's from Ethiopia, and so I love it. But I did not communicate well. And so when I brought Dan and Clark Newber in, I was like, listen, whatever we need to do, because this is a situation where I'm in control of this. This isn't Mark control like plagiarism or something like that. I'm in control of this. It's my fault. I want to do whatever the hell that we need to do to make this clear. And so they looked through everything and looked through all the communication, and I built binders for them that had kind of chronicled the way that we launched it and all that kind of stuff. And so basically, I said, Dan, what I'd like to do is I'd like to contact every single person that is given to Mars Hill Global and say, if you feel like that you were giving to Ethiopia, I will make damn sure that whatever the amount of money that you gave to Ethiopia or gave to Mars Hill Global will get to Ethiopia. And so I think we sent out 3,700 emails and 4,000 letters and got back 40 responses. And it was $40,000 that people had said, yes, I really felt like I was given to Ethiopia. And so, but that still I felt better because I felt like, okay, I've contacted every single donor. And if I misled them, I've corrected that mistake. I just, it was one of those things where I feel like that if we had handled other crises differently in the past, then Mars Hill Global wouldn't have blown up, and we would have been able to do what we did to correct the poor communication. And I think everything would have been different. But because even though we did those things, people assumed that there was something behind there, that, that there was some benefit that Mark was getting, or there was some agenda or something like that. But that was my fault. I mean, clearly my fault. And one of the greatest things that I look at, like, Sutton, you failed at Mars Hill Global. You absolutely failed. And so, I mean, that wasn't Dave's responsibility. It wasn't Mark's responsibility. That was my responsibility.
I think what you said there about the PR part is what I'll just make a quick comment on, and then we'll move on. The messaging about Global, when I started raising questions about it, that was really more the issue than what you did. What you did in response to it seemed really fair. By doing what you said, you offered the donors a chance to designate their donation in a way that they wanted to, and that gave them a chance to do just what some of them did. But the stories that the PR, and I'm blocking on his name, Dean, I think is his last name. Justin, there we go. I wanted to say Jamie, I don't know why, but Justin, Dean, he's gonna ding me for that. We're still in touch. I mean, I talk to him every now and then. But anyway, Justin was telling, and I guess I want to ask who was behind that. This is a curtain I want to draw back now. Was he in charge of messaging, or did someone tell him?
No. Mark is the communicator of communicators. So there's no communication that goes out that Mark wasn't involved with. The communication and that public side of things was important to Mark, whether it be Medford, whether it be, when Mars Hill Global broke, I was in Ethiopia, literally taking a bunch of pastors in Ethiopia. I was actually rooming with Ryan Williams at the time, because it was his first trip to the big Australian that's now in Albuquerque. And I was, because we're 10, 12 hours difference. I was trying to communicate, but it was all of that. The communication part was super important to Mark. So he would read through all of that, and the basic principle or the policy of we don't respond or we don't comment when news or you or somebody else calls and asks questions. That was very much driven by Mark. What was your perspective, Dave?
I think the thing that was hard for me personally in that season, Sutton, with Mars Hill Global, and probably because it was so on the heels, and I can't remember the exact timeline, but it's very much in proximity to the real marriage thing. Probably for me, that was the end of my journey philosophically with Mars Hill. I began to be very concerned that we were overlooking our local churches and focusing on the internet broader audience that we had. I understood, Sutton, and you know, I've talked many times about this, your heart from your perspective, having really come to faith through an online experience and a remote experience, and your passion to see more people like that would have been in your circumstance that were going to come through the door of a church, but might podcast a sermon and might get connected another way. I knew you had a missionary zeal for that. I knew it wasn't, self-motivated, but I really began to see that we're out kicking our coverage. This thing is becoming quickly unstable because we're not taking the time to support our local churches. Our attention really began to be diverted to an online, broader, global audience. And I really felt like in the end, that meant we were going to have anemic churches. And so, I don't remember. I appreciated that you reached out and initiated with Dan Busby and our accountants to remedy that situation. But there just was a transition that happened where all of a sudden, I think the people in the pews felt it really profoundly, where it almost became like they were secondary. And there was going to be this drive to really reach out to a global audience and there were limited resources. We were always doing everything we could to patch and put resources together so that we could do ministry. And it just felt like there was a season where there was a tipping point and we became much more of an internet organization reaching a global audience than we really were committed to the local church. And so for me, I began to see the writing on the wall at that point. Like, I don't think I can continue to do this. So this is a personal thought at that point.
All right. Well, thanks for that. Back to Driscoll now, to Mark. Did either of you ever personally see him domineering or abusive? Now, these are the things that were part of Dave Kraft's charges early in 13 there, and then these became part of the formal charges then in 2014. So did you see those things that became part of the substance of those charges?
Dave, you want me to go first? Yeah. So, I had a feeling you might ask us this question. And so I went back over the last 2 weeks and circled up with some people that at the time, when these things happened, I don't know if I realized the gravity of them, but now obviously you do. So I guess I'll go two different occasions. One was in September of 2013. We had our lead pastor residence program where pastors would come in, they would do a year's worth of residency at one of our local churches, and then we would plant them as a Mars Hill church location. And so this was that class coming in September of 2013. And it was really the first time that Mark had met them as a residence team. And just before, literally like right before that, couple of days before, we had found out that one of our pastors had disqualified himself. And we had to remove him from leadership. And so Mark walks into this setting with these lead pastors, and I was there. Several people were there, and he says, "quote If you," and he's talking about the lead pastor residence, "ever do something like that, being the disqualifying act, I will effing kill you," end quote. And so it was one of those just chilling moments. He was angry. And it was, I think that kind of sets itself. Then 2012, we're at the Ballard location. And Pastor Mark was preaching there locally. So this was before we had gone over to the location in Bellevue. And we were preaching from there and recording from there. And we had a tremendous response from baptism that day and that evening especially. There was, the lead pastor was actually out that day, and somebody else was stepping in that day to lead the church and to do the announcements from the stage and all of those types of things. And so during the sermon, there's a call to baptism. So many people literally get up and want to be baptized. Well, we had, I think, 2-3 songs after the baptism, and there's so many people wanting to get baptized that there's not enough time or change of clothes. It's an incredible. And so I'm backstage, Mark's backstage, and the lead pastor comes through there or the guy that was basically taking the place of the lead pastor. And Mark grabbed him and put his thumb in his chest and said, quote, "I'm going to rip your head off and S word down your neck," and pushed on him. And luckily that pastor didn't react back, just went on. We're looking, I mean, basically we're all scrambling, trying to get baptized. It was the last service of the day, you know, that type of thing. And it was, so those were the two things that I recalled, and then called those people to make sure that I got the words correct, because they were directly involved in that.
Wow.
I witnessed a few examples, Warren, maybe more seldom than people might think. A couple of them were private settings, and a couple of them were public settings. One of the things that we saw, especially as we began, as Sutton kind of architected the board of accountability advisors, we would do annual reviews. And I remember and at the end of those, we would gather together and we'd receive our reviews from the independent members of our board, job reviews. And I remember one of those years, Sutton, I think you got a hard hat because you were taking a lot of criticism. I received a bullhorn, like, "Hey, we need you to speak up more." And Mark received a lunch pail, and the inside joke was, let this be the last lunch you ever pack, because one of the things that Mark would do is he would not practice discipline within the organization chart. And if he felt like somebody needed to have their lunch packed, he would meet with that person privately, sometimes even unbeknownst to me or Sutton, pack that guy's lunch and then come back. And so I witnessed that on a handful of times. And I think what's interesting is when I was aware of those things, I would confront Mark with them privately, respectfully, and just say, "Hey, you know, it's not okay. You know, we can't, I think you need to think about this. I think you need to consider this." And his response was always interesting, because he didn't push back on me. He didn't blow up at me. He seemed to take to heart what I was bringing to his attention. He made a commitment in every instance to follow up with a person that he might have wounded. And I believe followed through with that. I think what was an area that maybe caused me some compassion, but also some deep concern, is he just didn't see it. I didn't sense that these were premeditated. Hey, I know what I'm about to do, and this is going to cause a lot of damage that I can empathize with and I can foresee. When I would bring these things to him, there was almost a shocked, surprised, "Really? Wow. You know, I don't remember. I don't remember that. I didn't see that." And so, you know, I began to think that maybe he just doesn't see things the way I see things, and he's not acting from a premeditated, malicious place of heart. He's blind to some things. He's got this blind spot, and yet that becomes more concerning. If you're wounding people deeply and you don't even know it, that becomes a real concerning issue. So those are kind of the things I saw, you know. And so, yeah, I did see some of those. You know, there was a strategy that I think was unannounced that Sutton employed, and that was to begin to almost isolate Mark from the organization. So we moved offices. Mark had very limited interaction with the staff. Usually when he did, it was in the best possible place that he would serve. It would be up front teaching. It would be encouraging. It would be sharing good news. But we didn't interact with many staff. And then Sutton and I really began to oversee almost the entirety of the staff. And I don't know if that was intentional, Sutton, on your part, to kind of isolate Mark so that we didn't have regular interactions. There was progress that he made along the way. If he, you know, those that were in the organization for long seasons, a decade or so, would say, "Hey, he's changing. He's not the guy he was 10 years ago. These incidents are far and fewer between. He's making progress," but they never stopped entirely as far as I remember.
Yeah, and one thing to point out there is that Dave had that opportunity to talk with Mark. I never had that. I mean, we played different roles,
Okay.
And I was not able to have those types of conversations or that place in leadership. But Dave did many times, a couple of times in front of me. I know when I resigned, Dave really stood up for me. So there were times that I saw from my vantage point to where Dave was like, wait a minute, this isn't right. This isn't, and called that out. So and I would say probably the only person that I know that's probably ever done that, or that I'm aware of, that's done that, as far as, hey, this is out of line. Hey, those types of things. Most people were like me in my place, which was, Mark would tell me to go do something, I go do it. Mark tell me to lead something or take on this responsibility, I go do that. Very much, he was my supervisor, and that felt like that. Dave was more on a different level than most everybody else was.
I see. I have here with me the charges that were filed, the formal charges, and let me just read a couple and get your reaction to those. Here's one. Mark said in a meeting that he didn't want a certain elder to take on a certain prominent leadership role because, quote, his fat ass is not the image we want for our church. Do you remember that?
So I don't remember that specific one.
I mean, is
Do
that...
you, Dave?
I don't remember that specific one.
That sound unusual, though? I mean, does that... Yeah. Well, here's one you might remember. In a meeting with lead pastors, shaming and bullying of a lead pastor to break his conscience and swear in front of the group. It says cuss in front of the group.
Yeah, I was present for that.
Yeah. I think he wanted him to use the F word, didn't he?
He just, as I recall, he wanted him to swear. And he, godly guy that he was asking to do this, different cultural background from Anglo culture, and came from more of a prime and proper culture, and he wanted him to swear. And I think he used the word damn, as I recall.
Okay.
To finally, yeah, I think he just wanted to hear him swear. And I think that's the word he used, as I recall. I may be wrong. Sutton, I don't know if you remember that directly.
No, I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah. And in that same meeting, he asked another lead pastor if he'd had sex with his wife. Yeah.
Yeah,
I witnessed that.
Yeah. Yeah. These, I haven't gone to a lot of churches in my life, but I've been on, most of the ones I've gone to, I've been on a board or something, and I've never heard anything like that in a board meeting. So yeah, I would think that would be a little concerning. And I mean, there's one, two, let's see, there's 2 or 3 pages of these different things. And these were investigated then by, we'll get to that in a minute, but investigated by a group of elders who interviewed lots and lots of people who, gave their testimony. Another person who was around Mars Hill at the time was Paul Tripp. Many of those watching this video, the viewers, will know who Paul Tripp is, and he was on the board of advisors, but he stepped off of the board in July 2014. I want to ask you guys if you know why he stepped off the board. He did say in reply to elders that he'd been consulting with, that this is without a doubt, referring to Mars Hill, the most abusive, coercive ministry culture I've ever been involved with. Is that part of why he stepped away?
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole part of Paul Tripp, it wasn't very long. It came out in July that he had left, but he actually left early June.
Okay.
It's just that we kept it under wraps because we knew that it would explode. What's interesting is that Paul, as you can imagine, is extremely busy person. And when we asked him to come out, he actually took a red eye the next day to come out and meet with me and Dave and Mark and our board chairman, and then also met that afternoon with some former elders. And he quickly, I think, realized, like what he said, that we had a horrible culture. And unfortunately for Dave and I, he had lots of meetings via conference calls, but Dave and I were never included on those conference calls with board members. And so we were actually excluded. And what's interesting is that, so he had come out twice. He had met with former former elders. He had met with Dave and I and Mark. And then the next thing I know, and Dave might have a different story, but next thing I know is he resigns. And I was shocked because honestly, I was hoping of all the people that were on the board that he was going to basically provide accountability onto the board, and for him to quit. I was shocked, to be honest with you. And, and I read, and I had very little interaction with him. But in hindsight, after I had seen what he had said, so he had resigned, and then a lot of that stuff came out, I was like, dadgum, I wish I had been a part of those conference calls, because I would have said amen to many of the things that he was saying. But I think that that's the reason why Dave and I were not included in those conference calls as well.
Yeah, I have a lot of, I have deep respect and appreciation for Paul Tripp, and really so appreciate the men who served in that capacity voluntarily, and especially at a time where Mars Hill was having a lot of problems. They did so at great cost. My understanding in follow-up conversations and just the work I did after the fact was, I think Paul came to the conclusion that the system as it existed, and specifically me and Sutton, were just not going to be able to hold Mark accountable to bring about the changes that he thought were necessary. And so I think he was committed to us as long as he saw the possibility that we were going to be able to make the changes that he thought needed to be made. And I think he came to the conclusion, like some others did too, that this just is going to happen this way, and stepped away. So that's my understanding. The quote that you mentioned, Warren, came from a conversation he had. It actually happened as we were having an elder retreat, right, with a subgroup of elders who were concerned. And I think he communicated that same sentiment to them, that neither Sutton and I were capable of really helping Mark and holding Mark accountable. And that moving forward, he had no confidence in us being able to do that. And I think he was right in that.
How about James McDonald? It's right around the same time. Didn't he step off of that same board? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah. So that was August, actually right before the Acts 29. So we had Paul Tripp leaving, we had James McDonald leaving, and then Acts 29 removes us as member. But James leaving, because he called me and talked to me, that he had just previously called Mark and had resigned to Mark. And so he had called me and said that he was sorry. And his reasoning is that he didn't, this was his comment, he didn't want what's happening to Mark to happen to him.
Okay.
And so he didn't want his elders supposedly at that point in time were asking him questions and everything. And this is when the pressure, so this is late July, early August of 2014, the pressure for there to be an investigation on Mark. So I'm actually vacationing. Mark is taking his sabbatical in Wenatchee. I'm actually in Wenatchee at the same time as Mark. And James calls and resigns and then calls me to tell me that he has resigned. And so literally within a very publicly, now Paul had actually quit the month of June, but publicly it came out in July that Paul resigns, then James resigns, and then soon after that, I think it was like August the 8th, that Acts 29 removes us. So those sequence happened, I'm going to say like in less than a month.
Oh, the dominoes were falling. Wow. It was, I think I wrote something like the worst week of Mars Hill's history. And then Acts 29 removes Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll all at once. So what can you probably have some recollections about that event. Acts 29 drops that bomb. What's that like inside the house?
Yeah, that was a devastating event. And when I would talk with the men I was responsible to serve, Warren, the lead pastors of all the churches, that's when the mass exodus happened. Probably in hindsight, our credibility as a church was riding upon our ongoing connection to Acts 29. There had been such Mars Hill had been more influential than any church in getting Acts 29 up and going. It was really an extension of our outreach ministry, even though it had been transferred over to Matt Chandler and the Village Church. And so people were thankful and proud and grateful for actually Matt Chandler had a tremendous amount of credibility. And so when we were removed from that network, the lead pastors I spoke to said that's when the most people at any point in time walked out the doors and never came back. I was actually in Texas when that happened. I was taking one of my daughters to college and dropping her off and spending the last few days with her. So I was on Central Time. I was up early. I think I got that at about 8 a.m. Central Time, which would have been 6 o'clock a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. So I called Mark and shared with him the news, and he seemed like he was stunned. And, we even had a brief conversation to the extent of, well, maybe this is it, maybe this is over at this point. And then we later, had time to think about it later. So was blindsided by that, had no idea whatsoever that was in jeopardy, had no idea the conversations that Matt and Mark were having, was unaware of the conversations that Matt Chandler was having with board members like Paul Tripp and maybe James McDonald as well. And that's what I think Sutton's alluding to in some of the other issues is, although he and I were part of the BOAA, there were many conversations that would happen, either one member to the next or all of them excluding us, that we were blindsided by that. We had no idea that was even a possibility. And so that really eroded any credibility that Sutton and I had too with any other leaders in the church, because they felt like we were sitting on this information for a long season, which we weren't. And so, yeah, that was tough. I've had conversations with Matt since, and he's convinced me that he and Mark did have quite a few conversations. Whether Mark realized the seriousness of those conversations and the formality of what was about to happen, I don't know. I can't speak to that. He says he doesn't, and I'll take him at his word. But yeah, that was a huge blow. That was really, there was no turning back at that point. We were really in a tough spot.
Yeah, one thing to keep in mind is the conversations that Paul Tripp was having with Mark and with James McDonald and the two other board members. Dave and I really didn't even know. Supposedly Paul presented a 7-point plan and only got through 4 points of it. That's what Paul has said. Of course, Dave and I weren't on the call. Similar at the Act Like Men conferences, Matt Chandler was talking to Mark that whole previous year. So all the year of 2013, they have Act Like Men events, which Mark is speaking, James McDonald speaking, Matt Chandler speaking. And so from my understanding, Matt was talking to Mark that whole year because they would come together for those Act Like Men conferences. And Matt was telling Mark, of course, not Dave and I weren't involved in those conversations. So when Matt, cuts off Mars Hill from Acts 29, it becomes a big shock to Dave and I, the same way that Paul Tripp quitting was shocking. And so during that whole summer, both Dave and I mean, it was just one thing after another that we'd be shocked in. And then people would turn to us because Mark was very much disconnected, like Dave was talking about, from a standpoint of a culture and Mark not packing anybody's lunch anymore. Mark was distant from the rest of the staff. So the staff was coming to us saying, okay, so what about Acts 29? So what are you on? And we would not be able to answer those questions. So it was just a crazy time during that summer of 14.
Yeah. And then right after the Acts 29, that's when the formal charges came, mid-August of 14. Then the 21 elders brought the formal charges. It was about a week after they were submitted that they were leaked to me and published. And that took, through the rest of August and September to investigate. That's when we get to October. And the findings are presented to the decision-making board by the Board of Elders. Now, I'm going to let you take us through that. The Board of Elders and the Board of Advisors, and there's so many boards.
Yeah.
And I think I've got it, but I know you do. And so I'm going to let you two take us through that. There are some shenanigans here because the board who investigated the charges came up with one finding, or several findings, but they came up with a particular finding that really didn't see the light of day, right? I mean, it didn't really come out, and we're talking about disqualification here. So if you guys could kind of take us through that, I think it would help maybe set the record straight on some things.
So I'll try to start, Dave, and then you can team in here. I think you go back to the early part of 2014. Early part of 2014, we add into the bylaws that a investigation will include, and so what we have is we have the Board of Accountability and Advisors. That's the main board of directors, basically, of the church, of the 501c3. Okay, and there's 7 members. Me and Dave are 2 of those members. Mark's 1, and then we have 4 outside board members. That board puts into the bylaws that a board of elders, and we'll just call them elders can investigate and do investigate allegations of any of the executive elders, and that is led by one of the Board of Accountability and Advisors. So that was huge, okay, because that's what didn't happen in May of 2013 when Dave Kraft and 9 elders brought similar charges. There was no process. There was nothing. There was no group to do that. So those happen, and that gets put into the bylaws. And so then we go all the way around, and we're in August now, and these 21 elders now are putting forth formal charges very similar to Dave Kraft's 2013 charges. But what happens is differently this time is per the bylaws, is that these elders, Board of Elders, investigate these charges. And so what they do, early part of August and or middle of August, and they really start at the end of August and they go through September, and they're investigating, and they do 40, they do 40 different interviews with 40 different people. There's 2 elders, there's a note taker, and they go through this. Literally hundreds of hours of testimony is being taken down. Luckily, through the process, I have all of those records. So I have not only the interviews, but also what's important and what was good for Dave and I to review was there was an October 1st, October 2nd, October 8th, October 13th, October 14th, and October 18th board of advisors, which is the main board of advisors, with these board of elders, with these investigating elders. And so we have transcripts of those meetings. Dave nor I think Dave, you might have been in one of those meetings, but I had already resigned. And so I was not a part of those, but I have all of the transcripts from those meetings. And so it documents basically out those pretty much their 3 main charges. And I said them earlier in the podcast, but it's quick-tempered, including harsh speech, arrogant, and the third one is domineering in his leadership of elders and staff. And so that's the findings that these investigating elders have, and that they are bringing those charges to the board of overseers, okay, which does not include Dave nor I in that, or Mark. So those are those outside 4 board members. And then I think actually, Dave, you might have been a part of one of those phone calls, but you can address that. But that's kind of where we track everything. And I think we can hit into the differences of those 2 groups and what ends up happening, because this all unravels very quickly in the first 2 weeks of October. If we'll remember, when Mark took his sabbatical, he was supposed to be out until October the 14th, I think. But it was right around there. Let's just call it the second weekend in October of 2014. And so that's what was trying to be wrapped up during that time period. And that was kind of like the drop dead date for the investigative, for the findings to come out, and for there to be something going forward. Of course, during this whole time, I mean, the churches, the people are leaving in droves, especially after Acts 29. That's really where you see the great exodus from the Mars Hill churches.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me speak to the meeting I was a part of. I probably not should speak to meetings I wasn't privy to. That would be dangerous. So I would have met Warren with, let's just call them, as Sutton has used the language already, the overseers. Those were the ones that were those were the outside board members that were making the final decision regarding, they were rendering the verdict of the investigation. And then the elders who had done all the investigative work. So I met with them, I believe it was Monday, October 13th. And the reason that date's significant is the overseers had met previously to that very, the weekend prior to that Monday. They had met with Mark and Grace, communicated to them the findings of the investigation, and gave them both some a restorative plan of what changes were going to happen and needed to happen for Mark to be leading the church moving forward. And so I was a part of the meeting where the overseers communicated to the elders, the investigative group, here's what we've communicated to Mark and Grace. There was some agreement in that meeting, and the 2 things that were really, even looking back over the notes from that meeting, 2 things that I think are important, particularly for members of Mars Hill to hear. The 2 points that were just evident were both bodies expressed deep love and concern for Mars Hill Church. That was clearly a point of agreement. 2, both groups expressed a deep love and appreciation for Mark, and really wanted good for Mark, wanted Mark, both groups wanted him to thrive long-term in ministry. But here were the 2 points of differentiation, and they were significant. The investigative group, the elders, wanted Mark to be disqualified from the office of elder and have an open timeline with his restoration process to restore him to the office of elder, and ultimately to resume his role as an executive elder at Mars Hill Church. The overseers did not want Mark to be disqualified as an elder, and they had set a target date of, I believe it was January 4th, 2015. So roughly, what would that be, 2.5 months for Mark to resume his duties, albeit in a reduced role of power. That was very clear in their plan. Sutton had already resigned. I'd already communicated to the overseers that I would step away as soon as Mark came back into the pulpit. Mark needed a clean start, and he needed new guys around him to gain credibility. He needed a new place to begin from. And so during that meeting, Warren, on that Monday, it was clear that those two groups were at an impasse, and a decision was made by the chairman of the Board of Overseers to have a follow-up meeting where they could maybe resolve those two differences. Again, whether Mark was disqualified or not, and at what point in time, if there was any set on the calendar for him to come back. I was very convinced that neither side was going to budge. I was very certain that if, and what I mean by that is if the overseers would have said, yes, this is what we're doing this, and you guys got to live with it, I think there would have been mass resignation from the Board of Elders and maybe even the lead pastors in their entirety. I don't believe the Board of Overseers was open to Mark being disqualified from ministry. I don't, from the elder role. I don't think they were going to give an inch on that issue, and I do think they were set on him coming back in January. Before those two groups could reconvene and come up with some sort of resolution, Mark resigned. And so, it's left the story open-ended in a way that I think it just needs to be told. I think people need to know what happened. I will say this, and just looking back on the work that the Board of Elders did, and even after they were finished with their work, I know Sutton and I met with several of the people that were hurt that they interviewed, and just to see the devastation and the hurt in those folks, they did a tremendous amount of work.
Yeah,
they were very principled. Their contention was, we can't be pragmatic in this at all. We're either going to follow out what the Bible says regarding biblical qualifications and in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 and domineering as it's addressed in 1 Peter 5. And they felt like to not disqualify Mark would to be partial to him in a way that they wouldn't be for any other elder in that position and place. And so, it was tough. I don't believe they were free to tell their story after that was said and done. I don't know that anybody's really shared anything from that to this day. And so anyway, there was an impasse. I don't believe it was going to be resolved. And before there could be a follow-up meeting between those two groups, Mark resigned.
The resignation it was an interesting story. He said something about he and Grace got separate messages from God about being, I don't know, ambushed or a trap had been set. And I don't know if either of you have any insight into that from, knowing him or just knowing of the situation. But the elders, again, said one thing, and the Board of Overseers said another thing. And so do you have any insight into what that might mean?
Yeah, so I don't know, Dave, if Mark called you. He called me to tell me that Grace was upstairs. He was downstairs, that God spoke to him and said that it was going to be ambushed, that they were going to be ambushed by obviously the elders. And then she came downstairs and had the same thing, and therefore that's why they resigned. And so that was on that day. And that's just what he told me.
Yeah, he and I never spoke about that, so we really didn't talk about that.
And so in the middle of the impasse between those two boards, that's when the resignation came.
Yeah, I think it was literally I think the resignation was submitted the day after that first meeting or the second day after that first meeting.
Now, there was to be a report that was released, or I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but there, everybody was kind of chasing that report for a long time, and the elders were very tight-lipped about it. Was there ever a written report, or was it more of a word-of-mouth report given to the decision-making body, the overseers?
So, I mean, we don't know. I don't know. I don't know if it was a written report that the leader of those board of elders was producing. I do know that that there were those meetings on the 1st, the 8th, the 13th, and the 14th, that you see the documentation of the elders basically giving their findings to the overseers verbally on conference calls. And then those conference calls having detailed notes of this person said this person said this, that type of transcript, I would say.
Yeah, I've never seen a formal report.
Okay. And then there was a kind of a script that some of the elders read to their congregations that did describe the results of the findings, that they did find him disqualified on those 3 counts that you listed. But that I don't know that conflict between the 2 boards has been laid out quite as clearly as you just did ever before. I think that you may have made some news there.
I'm not sure that I'm excited about making news, but I do believe, and I think you maybe were the first person that published it, Warren. I think you had the transcript from what Alex Gioni wrote or said to the congregation at Sammamish. That the content that was read in the churches on, I believe it was October 19th, 2014, was a compromise statement between the overseers and the elders. In other words, there was no disagreement. Okay. That was a worked out compromise, forged document that they read and that was scripted together. So that was actually the outcome of a follow-up meeting that they probably had on the 18th, I think, to what was going to be read in all the churches on the 19th.
Okay. And that's why in those statements that were read in the churches, the words disqualified and those specific charges weren't outlined. So that was that combined. So I think what you have later published, which was a statement that came out from the elders, which is different than what was actually communicated in the churches on that night, October 19th.
Mm. Well, okay. So at the time, the members would have been and were in the dark a bit. I mean, they really didn't realize that all of that investigating had led to the actual body who did the investigating coming up with the result that now you've described, that he was considered disqualified with an open-ended restoration plan.
Well, that was the detail. It wasn't ever worked out. I mean, that's the key. Like those two sides ever coming together with a plan on what the church. I mean, it was never. I mean, because Mark resigned before any type of a restoration plan, any of that was ever been able to be finalized.
Yeah. So something else that has been asked by a number of members of Mars Hill was about a payout, follow the money. Was there a payout at the end of, to Mark Driscoll at the end of Mars Hill? Does anybody know anything about that?
Yeah, so obviously I know a lot about the finances, having overseen them for 4 years. If you go back, so let me give a detailed answer to that question, because I think people need to understand why I'm saying it. In May of 2014, I put a plan together where we needed to lay off 40% of the staff, because at that point in time, we had decreased giving, and you could pretty much project that there was going to be a wall if we didn't do some massive staff reductions and reduce down the size. Of course, we're at 15 churches, all of those having either debt or lease expense. So you have you have a large amount of ongoing expenses, and you need to cut. Unfortunately, that plan was not put in place. And then you fast forward September 10th, we lay off 127 people in one day. And so that cut was too late, basically. And the dollars that were consumed during that time period and that whole summer, when you have decreased giving, pretty much consumed the majority of the dollars that were in the church. Now, understand, Mars Hill never really had any assets. Most of the churches that we owned were leased. And the ones that we did own, we put very little money down and didn't have really any equity in them. The one church that we had equity in, which was Ballard, that was finally sold, really to help pay off some of the additional debt that was on the other buildings. So when I left in the middle part of September of 14, I really wondered if they were going to be able to make that last payroll. Okay, so to say that there was some kind of big payout to Mark, it just wasn't going to happen. And he resigned 2 weeks later after I left. So within the time period of 2 weeks, that there's going to be millions of dollars that are going to be, it's just not going to happen. Dave stayed to the very, very end, December 31st, but I'm going to just tell you what it would look like, the financials look like in the middle of September of 14. I couldn't see that there was any way to pay off those buildings. And even a couple of those buildings, like the offices on 50th Street there in Ballard, it was a contaminated building that had significant contamination. And it was a real chore to try to get rid of that after they closed Mars Hill. So that's the detail that I can give you. No, I don't think, in my opinion, was Mark given any type of major payout because there was no money to pay anybody else out.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would have, like Sutton said, Warren, I would have been there through December 31st. Clearly the organization continued in a season after that with a very reduced staff. There were odds and ends to close down. There were documents to be filed. There were all kinds of things that happened. But up until the time that I left, I'm not aware of any payout that was made to Mark.
Well, that will be of interest to some of the members, I think, that were curious about that. Another question: did Mark ever wear a bulletproof vest?
Go ahead, Dave. You can answer this one.
Yeah, I think you're probably referring to, was that the Carey Nieuwhof interview he did?
Yeah,
where that statement was made?
Well, yes, there, and I think he has something on a website recently too, where he said that.
Okay, yeah. I personally never witnessed Mark wearing a bulletproof vest. I do know we always had security teams that watched him, watched after him. We do know he had some strange encounters with people that seemingly were unstable or might want to hurt him. I believe there's one episode that happened way before Sutton and I ever showed up, or maybe somebody charged the stage with a machete while he was preaching. But I personally never witnessed him wearing a bulletproof vest.
Yeah, I would, just to leave it open, I think when I was there, 99.9% of the time that Mark preached, I was there, and most of the time drove with him to the location wherever he was preaching, and I never saw a bulletproof vest at all. So,
okay. Well, all right. What about Phoenix? Phoenix just pop up here recently, or has there always been a design on a warmer climate?
Yeah, so if you go back and look at our board documents from 12 and 13, when we met on our annual board meeting, we were always talking about either Phoenix or Orange County doing either a host and moving the capture location of where Mark would preach to either of those two locations. So we had talked about that when we were leasing the building in Orange County. We talked about how that could be a capture location. And then when we went down to Phoenix and opened that church in Phoenix, we did a ton of surveying of the area of, what would be better, downtown Phoenix or Scottsdale or those types of areas. Were there any old churches? I spent a lot of time doing the research in Phoenix, looking for old church buildings, those types of things. So, that was nothing new for us to have talked about that. Now, if you go to the summer of 14, we had planned on by that time really focusing on Bellevue being the capture location. That being said, we had done all those research in many years before.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mark did genuinely suffer from seasonal affective disorder. You could feel it. It was a heavy thing for him. And then, particularly in the later years, Warren, with the visibility growing of Mars Hill, with already some of the issues that Mars Hill was unpopular, and certainly the message that was being taught wasn't widely received in Seattle. It was difficult, and I witnessed this personally with him. It was difficult for him to go anywhere in Seattle and not be at least approached by somebody. So, yeah, my thought was always that the viability of Seattle long-term for him, especially if he's going to do something outside of Mars Hill, was not an option. But yeah, we had decided, as Sutton said, we even went so far as we looked at an opportunity in Los Angeles. I don't know when that was, Sutton, but we actually looked at a building there and didn't pursue it, of even thinking about maybe relocating headquarters to Los Angeles in that season. But we had really settled on Bellevue. I believe it was Mark and Grace's intent to raise their kids in Seattle and get them to college there. And so we had kind of settled, hey, we're going to make Bellevue the home of this thing for the long term. We had some big dreams for that, and then everything came undone.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I 6 years ago, I would never have believed that we would be having this conversation. I mean, first of all, I would never have believed that we would be on anything called Zoom in a pandemic. But I certainly wouldn't have believed I would be chatting with you guys. And it's a tribute to Grace and all of that we are doing that. So I do thank you for your time, and I just ask you one last question here, and that is there anything you'd like to say to former Mars Hill Church members and attenders, or even to Mark? Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
I'll go first. Thanks, Warren. I want to apologize to you. I personally have attacked you in the past, never have met you before. And when I got to meet you post Mars Hill, realized that you're being a genuine Christian and loving the church and looking to do the right thing and to record the right thing. And I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate your friendship post Mars Hill.
We're all good. We're all good.
I appreciate that. Dave and I, since probably the last 2 years, probably the last 6 months, have done a bunch of podcasts with I Am Called Ministries. I think we did like 9 of them, or 8 or 9. I'm trying to chronicle the lessons learned from Mars Hill for pastors. I know I've met, and I know Dave's met, but I can only speak to myself. I've met with a bunch of people that I needed to reconcile with. I needed to own things, apologize for things, the way that I handle things. I'm going to continue to do that for people that need to, and maybe something in this video that's something that's triggered that they want to talk to me about. I'm totally open to continuing to have those conversations, to helping people heal and move on from Mars Hill Church. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast with you, Warren, is because you are a part of the Mars Hill story. And if we were going to sit down with somebody and put a period and to go through all the details of the stuff that we knew at Mars Hill. We would want to do it with you. So we really appreciate you. And so I'm just sad. Still have a hole in my heart because of Mars Hill. Have a hole in my heart because I know that there were things that I could have done, woulda, shoulda, coulda done differently that might have changed the outcome of Mars Hill. And that always is, that's going to be there always. And so I love the people of Mars Hill. I'm thankful of my time. I try to remember all the good things that happened because there was a lot of good things that happened.
Yes.
But I'm also not shying away from the bad things and what people need to learn about to possibly change churches as they go forward. And so that's one of the reasons why my wife asked me this morning, so why are you doing this today? I'm like, Marcy, we got to go through this. We got to talk about this, and we've got to bring some of this stuff back up for this never to happen again. So.
All right. Thank you. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. I do appreciate the opportunity. I think there's still a lot of holes in the Mars Hill story for a lot of the members, and my hope in sharing these things wouldn't be to open up old wounds, although I know that's maybe inevitable, but maybe to fill in some gaps in the story, because I do think that the truth helps us heal. Knowing exactly what happened is a step in knowing, okay, where do we go from here? How do we do that? So, I would say I feel three primary things, and want to say three primary things to the people of Mars Hill. Number one, I'm sorry. Not only did I personally fail you as a leader, we did. Sutton, Mark, and I failed you. We collect. It's easy to. It's easy, and I think it's simplistic to pin this all on Mark. I don't think that's fair. And I fail, and Sutton failed, and we failed together. And I know for some that's had devastating consequences. Some people have deconstructed their faith and are still really hurting to this day. And I'm sorry. I'm deeply sorry. And I pray for you. I want Jesus' best for you. I want healing for you. I'm thankful. I want to say thank you to the members of Mars Hill Church. I'm thankful for everybody, but I'm especially thankful for those who either participated in the church plants that came out of Mars Hill, whatever the circumstances were around that, or stayed with the remnant churches of Mars Hill and found strength, found grace of God to move forward and walking with Jesus today and staying faithful on his mission. I'm super grateful for you. Really thankful for the great people I got to serve with there. And probably the last thing I would say, and this may sound really strange after this interview, I'm hopeful. The story isn't over yet. And I think we have to have open hearts and open hands to the way in which the Lord might bring about redemption to this story yet. And by that, I mean everyone who participated. We know ultimately that will happen, right? From biblical perspective, we know all Jesus is going to make all things right ultimately. But I think even before that ultimate experience, I just want everyone to be, who can, by the grace of God, be open to what does it look like for repentance and reconciliation and some form of healing to happen. Anything I could say to Mark, I feel like I could say to him personally. I don't have personal hard feelings towards him. I don't feel like there's any personal offenses between the two of us that need to be resolved. If I did, I think I could pick up the phone and find out a way to communicate to him, and we could work those things out. So appreciate the opportunity to share this story, and I hope in some ways and in maybe unexpected ways this is healing and hopeful to the people who will watch and hear this.
Well, I think there are people who needed to hear what you guys have had to say in this time, and so bless you both. Bless you, Sutton. Bless you, David. And thanks for the time. Thanks for going over these very hard questions, and we'll just trust that indeed these will be redemptive words and that they will do what they need to do. So again, thank you. And again, thanks for being with me today.